Hello everyone, my name is Gemma from Family Story Research. Welcome to Fisherton Street, gateway to Salisbury. We're starting with this Edwardian postcard, which depicts a part of the city of Salisbury in Wiltshire. So here is Fisherton Bridge over the River Avon, and Fisherton Street leads out to the west here. In this talk, we are going to take a trip down Fisherton Street and along the way learn some of its history with a particular focus on inns, trades and shops. So let's begin with some history. Here is a map of Salisbury in 1773. You can see the city of Salisbury with its cathedral here. Fisherton Street starts here and goes out to the west to a more rural area. But you might notice this green and yellow boundary. This is because Fisherton Street was not at this time part of Salisbury. It was instead part of an earlier settlement called Fisherton Street. And this juxtaposition had some benefits for Fisherton Street. First of all, you can see it's clearly the western entrance to the city of Salisbury. So inns and hotels sprang up on the street. In addition to that, Fisherton Street was regulated by the county town of Devizes rather than Salisbury next door. And the licensing regulations in Devizes were looser, lighter than they were in Salisbury. And that meant that alehouses and beer production also flourished on Fisherton Street. In fact, in 1674, the number of alehouses was deemed excessive. They were suppressed for 3 months, but they came back and flourished once more. So, let's go back to Fisherton Bridge and find out about one of these alehouses, or in this case, an inn. You will see this building here on Fisherton Bridge. It goes back further than the picture shows. But in the 18th and early 19th century, it was part of the site of the Sun Inn. The Sun is on Fisherton Bridge, so just outside the boundaries of the city of Salisbury. This means it wasn't under the control of the Mayor and Corporation of Salisbury and didn't need to conform to the restrictions they imposed to protect city trade. So, for many years, the Sun was the venue for travelling exhibits, sales of goods, even a circus. Some surprising events were held at the Sun. For example, in a 1747 notice, at the Sun near Fisherton Bridge will be exhibited every hour for a few days longer the most surprising phenomenon of electricity. In addition, also in the 18th century, the Sun had its own theatre pit and held theatre performances, and rather less salubriously, cockfighting. A circus with horses and acrobats was held at the Sun 1843 to 44. This seems to have been the last event held at the Sun. It closed down and its building materials were sold off in 1844. So let's move a little bit further down the street to the Bull Inn, this white building here. It's just over the road and about 100 yards from the site of the Sun. And in 1805, it enjoyed a royal visit of sorts. The King, George III, passed through Salisbury on his way to the sea at Weymouth, and it was reported in the local newspaper. During the last week, our expectation of seeing their Majesties had been excited by the continual passing through of the King's servants, horses, carriages, and baggage. 10 of the cream-coloured state horses and 5 other of His Majesty's favourite horses rested here on Wednesday night in the excellent stables of the Bull Inn, Fisherton. Report doesn't say where the King himself stayed. But the present listed building dates from the late 19th century, and it was still a popular Salisbury pub until about 2014. Going back to the 19th century, in 1835, Fisherton Street was brought officially within the boundaries of the city of Salisbury, and so the alehouses and inns were now subject to the city's regulations. This makes it a good time to change focus to look at Fisherton Street shops. So here's a map of Fisherton Street. Here is Fisherton Bridge, just here where we've been before, with the railway station at the other end of the street. A small railway village and railway hotels built up around the station. In addition, 6 malt houses have been built here by 1879. And what about the other buildings on Fisherton Street? So here is an extracted list of traders from the 1875 Kelly's Directory. There's the typical trades you would expect: greengrocer, tobacconist, boot and shoemaker, for example. You might notice there is also a builder, contractor, brick, tile and cement merchant. Brickmaking was going on just to the west of Fisherton Street, and many of these bricks were used in the construction of Salisbury's buildings. So Fisherton Street in the late 19th century seems to be thriving. But there's a problem. The low-lying meadows and ground around Salisbury was vulnerable to flooding. You can just see it's cut off. This reads liable to floods. The River Avon flowed through Salisbury under Fisherton Bridge, and there was also a tributary of the River Avon going through Fisherton Street itself. This meant that Fisherton Street was particularly vulnerable to flooding. The local newspaper described a particularly bad flood in 1883. It described those meadows and low-lying ground around Salisbury as a sheet of water. The River Avon and its tributaries overflowed, so Fisherton Street was flooded. The newspaper went on to describe the scene the next morning. Tradesmen from the windows hailed passing vehicles and descending by ladders managed to get out into the street. Cabmen did good business. Charging 3d as fare, they drove hundreds through the wavelet-top lake. That was the general method of proceeding through the street. The Angel Hotel sustained a heavy loss. The water rushing in got into the cellar, and the bungs of some barrels bursting out, rum, gin and whisky, received a heavy dilution of dirty water. At the Bull Inn, water also got into the cellar, and the beer becoming mixed with it produced a very weak alcoholic beverage. Disaster indeed. And floods continue to be a problem. This picture shows a particularly bad flood in 1915. Only in the 1950s were improvements made, and the tributary was diverted, which seems to have been effective. On to the middle of Fisherton Street and an attractive piece of Art Nouveau. You can see the sign for Knight and Company, Poultry, Fish and Game Mart at number 47. This attractive sign was boarded over in the 1960s, presumably to put up the new shop name. Fortunately, the original decoration has now been uncovered and restored and can be seen on Fisherton Street today. Moving on to the Second World War, Salisbury was bombed during the war, and an Eve Chant recounts a particularly frightening story when she was walking along Fisherton Bridge in 1942. So her story reads, I was coming back from the town centre along Fisherton Street and was crossing Fisherton Bridge by the County Hotel. All of a sudden, a plane came in very low, which made me look up. Sure enough, it was a German. We could see the swastika. 2 soldiers, worried for her safety, pulled her down into the gents' lavatory to shelter. She continues. The plane was machine gunning and then dropped a bomb near the gasworks in Gas Lane. Then it came back. I was pulled down by the infirmary by 2 more American soldiers. As Mrs. Chant was passing Price's Butchers, Len Price rushed out and pulled her indoors just before bullets came flying down the street, shattering the windows of Bath Brothers, the greengrocers. So quite a lucky escape. And so we come to the end of our trip down Fisherton Street and almost to the end of our talk. In this picture from 2012, we're at the other end of Fisherton Street, standing on the railway bridge looking down the street leading to Salisbury city centre. And here is an earlier picture of almost the same view. And you can see the Dorchester Hotel in the foreground here. This was more commonly known as the London Hotel. It was one of the hotels which sprang up around the railway station, and it was called the London because it was opposite the London Line entrance to the station. The hotel closed in the 1980s, although the building still remains. Fisherton Street has experienced a lot of changes over the years. It may look different from the way it looked in the past, but many of the street's buildings are listed, and sometimes their original features are concealed by later 19th or 20th century buildings. The best example is this white building here. The listing from Historic England reads in part, late 19th century brick front of 3 stories, 2 windows, modern shop, concealing 16th century timber-framed building, 16th century moulded ceiling beams, 17th century panelling. So it seems the modern shop front conceals the original building. And maybe that's one way to look at Fisherton Street. Hundreds of years of rich history and fascinating stories concealed behind modern-looking facades. Of course, that's not the end of Fisherton Street's story. It's currently in the middle of a multi-million-pound regeneration project. And many of today's shops and businesses are now on the modern trade directory of social media and the internet. If you would like to know more, I've written a blog on the earlier history of Fisherton Anger on my website. I also highly recommend Fisherton History Society. They have a website and Facebook page and hold regular local talks and tours. And of course, the Victoria County History also has an extensive history on Fisherton Anger and Fisherton Street. So I hope you've enjoyed your trip down Fisherton Street, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the talks in the All About My Place event. Thank you and goodbye.